The morning rain in Naperville was not a gentle drizzle, but a persistent, cold needle wash that seemed to strip the color from the manicured lawns of my neighborhood. I stood in my kitchen, the heart of the home I had shared with Thomas for 35 years, feeling a strange, hollow lightness in my chest as I zipped my travel bag. Julian, my only son, had been so insistent, so unusually tender over the last few days, and his voice still echoed in the quiet room, telling me that I looked tired, that the grief of losing his father 2 years ago was still etched too deeply in my eyes. He had arranged everything: a retreat to the old family farmhouse in Galena, a place of dust and memories that had sat silent for a decade, inherited from my parents and largely forgotten in the bustle of suburban life. "Go enjoy the old house, Mum," he had whispered as he kissed my cheek the night before, his eyes shimmering with a fervor I mistook for filial love. "You need the quiet of the country to find yourself again. Eleanor and I will take care of everything here. Just drive, don't look back, and leave your phone off for once." I believed him because a mother's heart is designed to filter out the static of suspicion, especially when the signal is tuned to the frequency of her own child's voice. I looked at the framed photograph of Julian on his graduation day, his smile wide and full of the same charisma that Thomas once had, and I felt a surge of pride that he was finally taking charge, finally showing the maturity I had prayed for during his years of erratic business ventures and get-rich-quick schemes. I didn't see the jagged edges of the trap he had laid. I only saw the son who wanted his mother to rest. I was halfway to the garage, the keys to my aging Volvo clutched in a hand that trembled slightly from age and anticipation, when the first heavy thud against the front door stopped me cold. It wasn't the polite rap of a neighbor. It was a rhythmic, authoritative pounding that resonated through the floorboards like a drum of war. My heart began a frantic, uneven race against my ribs. I moved toward the foyer, peering through the sidelight, and the sight that met me was a cold, jagged shard of reality that shattered my peaceful morning. 3 men stood on my porch, their frames clad in dark, rain-slicked windbreakers, with bold yellow letters across the back that read FBI. Behind them, 2 local police cruisers sat at the curb, their lights silent, but their presence absolute. I opened the door, the cold air rushing in to meet the warmth of my home, and a man with eyes like grey flint stepped forward, flashing a gold badge that caught the dim morning light. "Margaret Sullivan?" he asked, his voice a flat, clinical rasp. I nodded, my tongue suddenly a heavy, dry stone in my mouth. "I'm Special Agent Miller with the Financial Crimes Division. We have a federal warrant for the seizure of this property and a summons for your immediate questioning regarding a multi-state bank fraud and money laundering scheme involving Sullivan Global Holdings." The words didn't make sense. Sullivan Global Holdings was a name I had seen on a few documents Julian had asked me to sign months ago. "Just some restructuring for the estate, Mum, to keep things simple," he had said with that blinding, reassuring smile. I felt the world tilt, the familiar walls of my hallway suddenly closing in as if they were made of cardboard. "There must be a mistake," I whispered, my voice a pale imitation of my own. My son manages our affairs. He's away on business." Agent Miller stepped into my foyer, his gaze sweeping over the family portraits, the antique hutch, the life I had meticulously curated, with a look of profound, professional indifference. "Mum, your son, Julian Sullivan, and his wife, Eleanor, were flagged leaving O'Hare International Airport late last night on a private charter to a non-extradition jurisdiction. According to our records, you are the sole registered officer of Sullivan Global. Your signature is on the loan applications for $2,500,000, all of which was funneled through shell corporations before vanishing into offshore accounts. This house, your retirement funds, and every asset in your name were used as collateral. As of 8 o'clock this morning, this property is in federal receivership. The humiliation was a physical weight, a cold, oily slick that coated my skin as they began to move through my rooms, tagging items, opening drawers, and treating the sanctuary of my marriage as if it were a crime scene. I stood in the center of my living room, the place where Julian had opened his Christmas presents, where Thomas had held me after my mother died, and I realized I was not just a mother anymore. I was a casualty of a calculated, predatory strike. The realization of Julian's final words, "Go enjoy the old house, Mum," began to burn in my chest like a slow-acting poison. He hadn't sent me to Galena for a retreat. He had sent me there because it was the only piece of land he couldn't easily liquidate, a place where I would be out of the way, isolated, and silent while the federal government dismantled my life. Eleanor's influence was everywhere in this betrayal, her cold, ambitious hand visible in the sophisticated layering of the fraud, the way they had used my trust as a blind for their greed. I was a 70-year-old woman with a bag packed for a weekend, standing in the ruins of a 35-year life, and the only person I had left in the world had just handed me a shovel and told me to dig my own grave. The drive to Galena was a blur of grey highway and the rhythmic, mocking swipe of the windshield wipers. I drove because I had nowhere else to go. The federal agents had allowed me to take my car and one suitcase, their mercy a chilling reminder that I was now a person of interest in a criminal investigation, my bank accounts frozen, my credit cards useless pieces of plastic. As the skyscrapers of Chicago faded into the rolling, desolate hills of rural Illinois, the silence in the car became an unbearable roar. Every mile took me further from the woman I used to be, the respected librarian, the neighbor, the friend, and closer to the inmate 4192 I feared I would soon become. I thought of the countless times I had bailed Julian out of his minor setbacks, the times I had silenced Thomas's doubts by telling him that Julian was just a late bloomer, that he just needed one big break. I had funded his delusions with my silence, and now that silence had cost me my soul. I reached the farmhouse in the dying light of the afternoon. The structure sat at the end of a long, overgrown gravel drive, its white paint peeling like dead skin, the porch sagging under the weight of a decade of neglect. It was a skeletal remains of my childhood, a place that smelled of damp wood, mouse droppings, and the heavy, stagnant scent of things left to rot. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my feet as if protesting my return. There was no power, the lines having been cut years ago, and the air inside was colder than the rain outside. I moved through the kitchen, my breath blooming in white puffs in the dim light, and I saw the rusted hand pump over the sink, the cracked linoleum, and the shadows that seemed to pool in the corners like spilled ink. I was 78 years old, and I was starting over in a tomb. As night fell, thick and absolute, I huddled in my wool coat on an old moth-eaten sofa in the living room, the only light coming from a single battery-powered lantern I had found in my trunk. The silence of the country was not peaceful. It was a predatory thing, a vast, echoing emptiness that amplified the voices in my head. I kept hearing Julian's laughter from his wedding day, the way Eleanor had looked at the house in Naperville, with a proprietary glint in her eyes even then, and the subtle way she had begun to criticize my old-fashioned ways, my unnecessary attachment to Thomas's things. They had played the long game, eroding my confidence, feeding my grief until I was too tired to read the fine print, too eager for their approval to question the documents they slid across the dinner table. My own son had looked me in the eye and used the memory of his father to facilitate a theft that would leave me destitute and potentially imprisoned. I felt a surge of incandescent fury, a white-hot spark in the center of my hollowed-out chest that the cold couldn't extinguish. I was Margaret Sullivan, a woman who had managed a city library system, who had raised a child on a librarian's salary, who had stood by her husband through 3 bouts of illness, and I would not be buried in this dirt. I remembered Thomas's voice, his quiet strength, and the way he always said that information was the only true currency in a world of thieves. Julian and Eleanor had made a critical mistake. They believed that because I was old, I was obsolete. They believed that by stripping me of my home, they had stripped me of my power. But they had forgotten that I was the one who kept the records, the one who understood the filing systems of the soul. The next morning, I was awakened not by a bell, but by the biting chill of the Illinois winter. I performed the mandatory tasks of survival, washing my face with ice-cold water from a jug, eating a dry granola bar from my bag, with a mechanical, military efficiency. I began to search the house, not for comfort, but for leverage. This farmhouse had been in my family for 4 generations, a masterpiece of rural resilience, and my father had been a man of hidden compartments and quiet contingencies. I climbed the stairs to the attic, the air thick with the dust of a century, and I began to move the trunks of old clothes and forgotten tools. My hands, gnarled by age but steady with purpose, searched for the one thing I knew my father would have kept, the ledger of the deep earth. I found it behind a loose stone in the chimney breast, a small, heavy iron box, rusted at the hinges but still defiant. Inside were not jewels or cash, but something far more lethal to Julian's plans: the original land grants and a series of mineral rights surveys conducted 50 years ago. My father had discovered a vein of rare earth minerals on a small, detached 10-acre plot near the Mississippi River, a piece of land that had been lost in the tax records because of a clerical error in the 1960s. Julian, in his frantic greed to seize the primary estate and the suburban equity, had missed this. He hadn't bothered to look at the worthless rural holdings in their entirety. This land was legally mine, unencumbered by the federal lien, because it had never been declared as part of the Sullivan Global Collateral. It didn't exist on any modern spreadsheet. As I stared at the yellowed maps, the realization began to bloom. I was not a victim in a concrete box. I was a general in a tactical operations center of my own making. I needed a lawyer, not a city shark, but a man of the earth who understood the old guard of Illinois power. I remembered a name Thomas had mentioned years ago: Silas Vance. He was a retired litigator who lived in a restored mansion on the hill in Galena, a man who had built a career on dismantling the very kind of financial predators Julian had become. I had no money for a retainer, but I had the 3 keys Thomas had told me about: loyalty, old debts, and a name that carried the weight of integrity. The walk into town was 3 miles of freezing wind and gravel, but I didn't feel the ache in my knees. I walked with the cold, unflappable composure of a woman who has already seen the bottom and decided she doesn't like the view. Galena was a town of pink sandstone and colonial memories, a place where people still looked you in the eye. I found Silas Vance's office, a quiet, mahogany-scented sanctum that smelled of old leather and tobacco, much like the library Thomas had loved. Silas was a man in his late 70s, with kind, tired eyes that had seen too much and a posture that remained impeccably upright. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said as I placed the iron box on his desk, my fingers blue from the cold but my gaze level. "I've read the news. The city papers are calling you the architect of the Naperville fraud. They say you've been hiding out here, waiting for the storm to pass." I sat in the uncomfortable wooden chair across from him and leaned forward. "Mr. Vance, I am a 78-year-old librarian whose son just used her life as a human shield. I am not hiding. I am preparing a counterstrike. I opened the box and slid the mineral rights survey toward him. Julian Sullivan thinks he has neutralized me. He thinks he has won $2.5 million and my silence. He is dangerously mistaken. Silas adjusted his glasses, his expression moving from professional distance to a sharp, burning interest as he reviewed the documents. Do you know what this is, Margaret? These aren't just old surveys. This is the deed to a strategic resource that the state has been trying to locate for a decade for their green energy initiative. If this land is where these maps say it is, its value dwarfs the debt your son has incurred. He looked up, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of the legal titan he had once been. They believe you are defeated, isolated, and broken. We need to let them believe that. We need Julian to be overconfident. He leaned back, his fingers interlaced over the file. For the next 2 weeks, you will live in that farmhouse. You will be the defeated widow the prosecution expects to see. But you will not be alone. I have a direct line to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Chicago, a man who owes his career to a favor your husband, Thomas, once did for his father. We are going to turn your son's, Sullivan Global, into a federal wire fraud trap that will decimate him and that viper he married. He pushed a clean notepad and a pen across the desk. Start by writing down every conversation, every signature Julian streamlined, and every offshore account Elena mentioned. We aren't just clearing your name, Margaret. We are reclaiming your life. I took the pen, the weight of the injustice and the relief of the unexpected alliance coalescing into a single, burning purpose. I walked back to the farmhouse as the sun began to peek through the grey clouds, a promise of a light that was coming to expose the darkness. My son believed he had buried me in the past, but he had only planted me in the one place where I knew how to grow. The war for my soul, for Thomas's legacy, and for the truth had officially begun. I closed the door of the old house, and for the first time in years, the sound of the lock clicking into place didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a tactical choice. The cold in the Galena farmhouse was a living thing, a sharp, invasive presence that seeped through the cracks in the window frames and settled into my marrow like a permanent resident. I wrapped myself in Thomas's old wool hunting coat, the one that still held a faint, heartbreaking scent of cedar and the peppermint candies he used to keep in his pockets for Julian. Sitting on the edge of the sagging mattress in my childhood bedroom, I watched the rhythmic dance of dust motes in a single pale shaft of September sunlight that pierced the grime of the window. Julian had told me to find myself here, but all I found were the echoes of the woman I used to be, and the terrifying shadow of the man he had become. My mind, fueled by hunger and the stinging clarity of betrayal, began to drift backward, unspooling the thread of our lives to find the exact moment the rot had set in. I remembered Julian as a toddler, his small, warm hand tucked into mine as we walked through the stacks of the library, his eyes wide with wonder at the rows of books he thought were doors to other worlds. We had given him everything, not out of wealth, but out of a desperate, sacrificial love that Thomas and I wore like armor. I recalled the nights I stayed up until 2 a.m, my eyes burning under the glow of a single lamp, mending uniforms and sewing costumes so he would never feel the sting of our modest means. Thomas had worked double shifts at the transit authority, his large hands calloused and stained with oil, just to ensure that Julian's college fund was a solid, untouchable promise. We believed that by shielding him from the wind, we were teaching him how to stand. Instead, we were only ensuring he never learned the value of the ground beneath his feet. The silence of the farmhouse was occasionally broken by the structural groans of the settling wood, sounds that I once found comforting, but now felt like the ticking of a countdown clock. I thought of the day Julian brought Elena home to Naperville. She was polished, sharp-edged, and radiated an ambition that felt like a cold draft in our warm living room. She looked at our comfortable, lived-in furniture with a clinical, evaluating gaze, as if she were already mentally listing the items for a garage sale. Eleanor didn't just walk into Julian's life. She colonized it, subtly eroding the foundations of his character, until he viewed Thomas's integrity as a burden and my devotion as a resource to be exploited. I remembered the first time Julian asked me to co-sign a minor business credit line. I had hesitated, feeling a prickle of intuition in my bones, but he had looked at me with Thomas's eyes and told me he just needed a bridge to the future. I signed because I wanted to believe in his dreams, and because Elena was standing behind him, her smile a masterpiece of predatory reassurance. That single signature was the first drop of blood in the water, and they had been circling ever since, waiting for the moment I was most vulnerable, the moment Thomas's heart finally gave out. Hunger has a sound that no one else hears, a hollow, scratching silence that grows from within until it consumes your ability to think of anything but the next bite. I had been eating only hard bread and small portions of canned soup for 3 days, hoarding my meager supplies like a prisoner of war. Every time my stomach cramped, I thought of Julian and Eleanor at some luxury resort, drinking champagne that cost more than my monthly property taxes, laughing about the old-fashioned mother who was currently rotting in the woods. The humiliation was a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth. I had spent 40 years building a reputation of dignity and service, only to be branded a federal criminal by the one person I would have died to protect. The townspeople in Galena, usually kind, now looked away when I walked to the local market to buy my single loaf of bread. I was no longer Maggie Sullivan, the librarian. I was the Sullivan fraud, a cautionary tale whispered over morning coffee in the pink sandstone buildings downtown. In the long, freezing nights, I huddled in the dark, the battery-powered lantern casting long, distorted shadows on the peeling wallpaper. I began to treat my isolation as a tactical discipline. If I were truly the architect of a fraud, I would be planning my next move, and Julian's greatest mistake was assuming that my age had robbed me of my sharpness. I spent hours in the attic, going through the old ledger I had found, my fingers tracing my father's meticulous handwriting. He had been a man who prepared for the lean years, a man who understood that loyalty was a debt that must eventually be settled. The maps of the mineral rights were not just paper. They were a roadmap to my resurrection. I began to memorize the names of the stakeholders, the geographical coordinates, and the legal language of the old land grants. I wasn't just a mother mourning a betrayal. I was an observer, a silent, lethal agent of information and gathering the stones I would eventually throw. The memory of Charles's death, no, Thomas's death, rushed back with the force of a physical blow. I remembered the knock on the door, the chaplain's hat in his hands, and the world turning grey as the air left my lungs. Julian had been there, crying on my shoulder, but even in the height of my grief, I felt a strange, calculated distance in his touch. He began talking about streamlining the estate within 48 hours of the funeral, his words a soft, insistent drone, while I was still trying to remember how to breathe without Thomas beside me. Eleanor had taken charge of the paperwork, her movements efficient and cold, sliding documents across the dining room table while I sat in a daze of painkillers and sorrow. "It's just to protect you, Mum," Julian had said, his voice a pale imitation of Thomas's warmth. I signed because I was tired, because I wanted the noise to stop, and because I believed that a son would never lead his mother into the fire. Now, sitting in the silence of the farmhouse, I looked at my gnarled, wrinkled hands and felt a surge of incandescent strength. Julian had stripped me of my home, my money, and my reputation, but he had forgotten to strip me of my mind. I began to formulate the plan with Silas Vance. We would wait. We would let the federal government move through its clinical, slow-motion procedures. We would let Julian and Eleanor grow overconfident in their non-extradition paradise, believing that the old woman was a broken, silent relic of the past. I would play the role of the defeated widow, the invisible old woman who had finally been erased from her own life. But every day I was in this farmhouse, I was reclaiming a piece of myself that I had given away to Julian bit by bit over 32 years. The realization that I had survived the first week in Galena was my first small victory. I had managed to fix a small leak in the roof using an old tarp and some heavy stones, my fingers bleeding from the cold, but my heart steady. I had found a hidden stash of my mother's preserved peaches in the back of the pantry. The jars dusty, but the contents a sweet, golden reminder of a time when love was a simple, nourishing thing. As I ate the fruit, the syrup coating my dry throat, I realized that Julian's betrayal was not just a crime of money, it was a crime of memory. He wanted to rewrite our history, to turn Thomas and me into nothing more than footnotes in his pursuit of a luxury that had no soul. But I was the keeper of the books, and I knew how the story was supposed to end. I began to use the secure landline Silas had provided, my voice a quiet, precise instrument as I coordinated with Harrington in Chicago. We were watching the Sullivan Global accounts, tracking the digital footprints Julian and Eleanor were leaving in their arrogance. I watched the live surveillance feed from my house in Naperville, the house that was no longer mine, and saw Eleanor draped across my favorite sofa, drinking my wine and discussing the modernization of my life with a dismissive laugh. I didn't feel rage, I felt a cold, surgical detachment. Every bottle they opened, every piece of furniture they tagged for removal, was another item on the bill they would eventually have to pay. The nights in Galena were long, but they were no longer empty. I filled them with the names of the people who owed Thomas favors, the judges, the power brokers, the old guard, who still remembered the weight of his integrity. Julian thought he had moved into a new world of shell corporations and digital fraud. But he didn't understand that the real power in Illinois still moved through the quiet networks of loyalty and old debts. I was no longer a casualty of his war. I was the architect of his reckoning. I would stay in this cold farmhouse. I would eat my hard bread, and I would wait for the moment the sun rose on the day of his defeat. As September turned to October, the hills of Galena blazed with a fierce, defiant orange and red, a mirror of the fire that was now burning in my own chest. I had spent 78 years as a woman who made things easy for others, who stayed in the background, who whispered so as not to disturb the silence. But that woman was gone, buried under the weight of Julian's betrayal. The woman who remained was Margaret Sullivan, the widow of Thomas, the daughter of the earth, and the owner of a dignity that no hammer could break. I looked at the maps spread across the kitchen table, the coordinates for the mineral rights glowing under the lantern light, and I knew that Julian's Sullivan Global was about to collide with a reality that no offshore account could hide. The time for Kim Nen, for suppression, was ending, and the time for Kong Lee, for justice, was about to begin. I stood up, my joints creaking, but my posture upright for the first time in years, and closed the ledger. I was ready to step out of the shadows and face the monsters I had accidentally raised. The darkness in the Galena farmhouse was no longer just an absence of light. It had become a thick, suffocating shroud that smelled of damp earth and the slow rot of forgotten things. I sat by the window of the upstairs bedroom, the one that used to be mine when the world was young and full of promises, watching the moon cast long, skeletal shadows across the overgrown yard. My stomach was a tight knot of hunger, a dull, persistent ache that reminded me with every breath that I was a woman discarded. But as the hours bled into the deep, silent reaches of the night, the physical pain began to pale in comparison to the spiritual devastation that was settling into my soul. I had spent 78 years believing in the fundamental goodness of the people I loved, especially the child I had carried under my heart. I had believed that sacrifice was a currency that bought loyalty, that devotion was a shield against the cruelties of the world. Standing in the ruins of my life, I realized that I had been a fool. Julian hadn't just stolen my money and my home. He had stolen the very foundation of my reality. He had looked at my aging face, saw the love I held for him, and used it as a blueprint for my destruction. The silence was broken by the frantic scratching of a mouse behind the wainscoting, a sound that felt like the gears of a trap closing around me. I thought of the documents Silas Vance had shown me earlier that day, the bank records he had managed to obtain through his unofficial channels. They were a roadmap of depravity. Julian and Eleanor hadn't just taken a loan. They had engaged in a systematic liquidation of my existence. They had sold my jewelry, pieces Thomas had given me for anniversaries, items that held the weight of decades of shared whispers and quiet laughter. They had emptied the small savings account I had kept for my granddaughter's college fund. But the crowning blow, the one that felt like a cold blade through my ribs, was the discovery that they had used my identity to secure a high-interest bridge loan from a private equity firm that was little more than a front for a criminal syndicate. My son hadn't just put me in debt. He had made me a debtor to monsters. I leaned my head against the cold glass of the window, the condensation from my breath blurring the outside world. I remembered Julian's 8th birthday. He had wanted a bicycle more than anything in the world, a red Schwinn that cost more than Thomas and I could afford in a month of Sundays. We had skipped meals, worked extra hours, and saved every penny to see the look of pure, unadulterated joy on his face when he saw it parked by the tree. That boy, the one with the scraped knees and the bright, hopeful eyes, was gone. In his place was a man who viewed his mother's survival as an inconvenient overhead cost. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I realized that the vacation he had sent me on was intended to be my final act. He had expected the cold, the isolation, and the sheer weight of the humiliation to break my heart, literally. He didn't want me to fight back. He wanted me to fade away in the shadows of this old house, so that he and Eleanor could move on to their next conquest, unburdened by the living ghost of their greed. The humiliation of being inmate 4192 in waiting was a bitter pill that I swallowed every morning with a sip of tepid water. The federal investigators were circling, their phone calls becoming more pointed, their questions more accusatory. They saw a woman who had signed everything, who was the president of a shell company, and they saw a convenient scapegoat. The psychological weight of being perceived as a criminal by the world, when I had spent my life as a servant of the community, was almost enough to shatter my resolve. I felt the eyes of the town on me whenever I went to the post office, pitying looks from some, sharp, judgmental glares from others. I was the woman who had failed as a mother so spectacularly that her son had become a national headline for fraud. I was the woman whose greed had supposedly led her to embezzle millions. The truth was a quiet, fragile bird trapped in a cage of fabricated evidence, and I was the only one who could hear its song. But it was in this heart of darkness, this absolute zero of the soul, that the iron Silas Vance spoke of began to forge itself. I stopped crying. The tears had been a luxury of the person I used to be, a woman who still hoped for a miracle. The woman I was becoming didn't need miracles. She needed data. I spent my nights in the attic, the light of my lantern flickering against the rafters, going through every scrap of paper I had brought from Naperville. I began to find the patterns. Elena's handwriting was on the sticky notes attached to the most damning documents. Julian's distinctive, rushed signature was always paired with a date when I was known to be elsewhere, attending a garden club meeting, visiting a friend in the hospital, or at the cemetery with Thomas. They were arrogant. They believed I was too distracted by my grief to notice the timeline. They believed I was too technologically illiterate to understand the digital breadcrumbs they were leaving behind. I met Silas again in the dim light of his study, the air thick with the smell of old books and the promise of a fight. "They think they've cleared the board, Silas," I said, my voice sounding older, raspier, but steadier than it had in years. "But they've forgotten that I spent 30 years managing a library. I know how to find the things people try to hide. I've found the discrepancies in the wire transfers. Julian was using my old laptop, the one he fixed for me, to access the accounts. But he forgot that the IP address would show he was at his condo in the city, not at my house in the suburbs." Silas looked at me, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. "You're doing more than just surviving, Margaret. You're building a case for a RICO indictment. If we can prove that Eleanor was the one who set up the shell corporations in the Cayman Islands using your forged power of attorney, we don't just clear you, we bury them." The Kim Nen, the suppression of my own instincts, was finally over. I began to see the world not as a place of safety that had been stolen from me, but as a battlefield where I held the high ground. I realized that my perceived weakness was my greatest strength. Because they thought I was a broken old woman, they weren't watching me. They were busy celebrating their victory, buying property in a country that wouldn't send them back to face the music. But the music was already playing, a low, discordant hum that was growing louder every day. I began to feed information to Silas, who in turn fed it to his contacts in the US Attorney's Office. We were playing a dangerous game of cat and mouse, and for the first time in my life, I was the one with the claws. One night the phone rang, a burner phone Silas had given me. It was Julian. His voice was smooth, dripping with a false, oily concern that made my skin crawl. "Mom, how are you doing out there? I know it's tough, but Elena and I are working so hard to clear this all up. Just stay put, okay? Don't talk to any lawyers. Don't make things worse for us. We'll be there to get you as soon as the heat dies down." I stayed silent for a long moment, listening to the sound of his breathing, the sound of the child I had once rocked to sleep. "I'm fine, Julian," I said, my voice a flat, emotionless mask. "The house is quiet. It's exactly what I deserve, isn't it?" There was a flicker of hesitation on his end, a brief crack in his armor. "Just stay there, Mum, for your own good." When I hung up, I felt a strange, cold peace. He had just confirmed his own guilt. He wasn't worried about me. He was afraid of me. I looked at the photograph of Thomas on the mantelpiece, the one I had carried with me from the house in Naperville. His eyes seemed to hold a flicker of the old fire, a reminder that the Sullivan name stood for something more than a line item on a ledger. I wasn't just fighting for my freedom. I was fighting for the dignity of every woman who had been told she was too old to matter, too soft to survive, or too motherly to be a threat. The darkness of Galena was no longer a prison. It was a cocoon. And when I finally emerged, I wouldn't be the mother Julian expected. I would be the storm he never saw coming. I spent the rest of the night mapping out the final pieces of the puzzle. I had the mineral rights, I had the forged signatures, and I had the digital trail of their betrayal. But I needed one more thing. I needed to see the look in Elena's eyes when she realized that the old woman had outmaneuvered her. I needed to witness the moment the power shifted. As the first light of dawn began to grey the horizon, I felt a sense of clarity that was almost holy. I was Margaret Sullivan, and I was no longer afraid of the dark. I was the dark, and I was coming for them. The heavy iron box on the kitchen table felt like an anchor in a storm, its rusted surface a testament to the fact that some things are built to endure the salt and the rot of time. I sat in the flickering amber light of a single kerosene lamp, my fingers tracing the jagged lines of the mineral surveys I had unearthed from the chimney's secret heart. For the first time since the FBI had darkened my doorstep in Naperville, the air in my lungs didn't feel like crushed glass. I was no longer just Margaret Sullivan, the widow who had been discarded like a piece of broken furniture. I was a woman holding the deed to the very earth Julian and Eleanor had tried to bury me in. The realization that they had missed this, that in their frantic, shallow greed, they hadn't bothered to look past the surface of worthless, rural dirt, was a fragile, sparking hope that began to illuminate the corners of my mind. I looked at the coordinates, my librarian's brain cross-referencing the decades-old data with the current geological maps Silas Vance had provided. This 10-acre plot, hidden under a clerical error and a century of family silence, sat directly atop a rare earth mineral deposit that the state was desperate to secure for their new energy initiative. Its value was not just in the millions, it was a strategic asset that carried the weight of political influence. I wasn't just wealthy again, I was powerful. But power is a dangerous thing if revealed too soon, a lesson I had learned from watching Julian's clumsy, loud attempts at success. I needed to move with the silence of a shadow. Silas and I spent the next 3 days in a fever of tactical planning, the farmhouse kitchen transformed into a war room. We communicated through encrypted channels Silas had established, his voice over the phone a steady, rhythmic cadence of legal strategy. "They are going to try to sell the Naperville house on the 15th, Margaret," he told me, his tone as cold as the frost on the window pane. "Julian has a buyer lined up, a shell company that Elena is secretly managing. It's a classic equity stripping maneuver. They want to wash the money through the house before the federal lien fully hardens. If they succeed, they vanish with the cash, and you are left with the criminal liability for the original fraud." I felt a shiver of icy resolve. They were coming for the last piece of my history, the home where Thomas's scent still lingered in the closets. But this time, I wouldn't be standing on the porch crying. I would be the ghost in the machine. We initiated the first phase of our counterstrike, the phantom asset gambit. Using the mineral rights as collateral in a way that wouldn't trigger the federal monitors, Silas helped me secure a private, confidential line of credit through an old money trust in Chicago that loathed the kind of new money predators Eleanor represented. For the first time in weeks, I had resources. I didn't spend a dime on comfort. I didn't buy better food or fix the heating. I stayed in the cold, wearing my layers of wool, fueling my body with the bare minimum. I needed the world, and most importantly, I needed Julian to see me as the broken, destitute woman they had created. I needed the FBI surveillance to record me as a harmless relic of a bygone era. I spent my days walking the perimeter of the farmhouse, head bowed, shoulders slumped, playing the role of the defeated mother to perfection, while beneath my coat, I carried a high-end recording device and a tablet that Silas had taught me to use to monitor the digital movement of Sullivan Global. The psychological toll of this double life was a heavy, suffocating weight. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw a stranger, a woman with eyes of flint and a heart that was hardening into something unrecognizable. I thought of the nights I had spent rocking Julian through his fevers, the way I had defended his every mistake as growth, and the way I had allowed my love to blind me to the predator he was becoming. The pain of that realization was a sharp, jagged edge that I used to keep myself awake. I wasn't just fighting for my house. I was fighting to reclaim my own judgment. I was fighting to prove that the 40 years I spent as a librarian, a wife, and a mother hadn't been a waste. I was turning my pain into a surgical instrument. One afternoon, a black SUV pulled up the long gravel drive. My heart hammered against my ribs, a panicked bird in a cage, but I forced my hands to stay still. I stepped onto the sagging porch, pulling my shawl tight, looking every bit the frail victim. The man who stepped out was not an FBI agent. He was a private investigator hired by Eleanor, a man named Miller with a face like a closed book. He walked up to the porch, his eyes sweeping over the peeling paint and the overgrown weeds with a look of profound contempt. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, tipping a hat he didn't really mean, "I'm here on behalf of your son. He's concerned you aren't managing well out here. He's sent some papers for you to sign. A voluntary relinquishment of the Galena property to Sullivan Global. In exchange, he's willing to pay for a very nice assisted living facility in Florida, under a different name, of course, to keep you safe from the authorities." The audacity of the move was breathtaking. They wanted the farmhouse, too. They wanted me silenced in a gilded cage in a state where I would have no legal standing, hidden away like a shameful secret. I looked at the papers he held out, the ink dark and predatory. I felt a surge of rage so intense I feared I might scream, but I channeled it into a trembling hand. I looked at Miller, my eyes watering, not from grief, but from the cold wind and the sheer effort of the deception. He wants me to go to Florida," I whispered, my voice cracked and small. "He thinks I can't take care of myself." Miller nodded, a patronizing smile touching his lips. "It's for the best, Margaret. The federal case is getting ugly. This is your only way out." I took the pen, my fingers shaking, and I signed the name Margaret Sullivan in a deliberate, unsteady scrawl. But beneath the table, I was pressing the record button on my device. He had just delivered a verbal admission of an attempt to coerce a witness and hide a suspect. When the SUV disappeared down the drive, I walked back into the kitchen and sat in the dark for a long time. The fragile anchor of the mineral rights had just been reinforced by their own arrogance. They thought they had finally erased me. They thought they had the last piece of the puzzle. They didn't know that the signature I had just given was a legal poison pill. Silas had prepared a specific addendum that I had memorized. A tiny, almost invisible clause in the original family land grant that prevented the transfer of the property to any corporate entity without a 90-day cooling-off period and a mandatory environmental audit due to the hidden mineral status. By signing those papers, I hadn't given them the land. I had triggered a legal alarm that would freeze all of Sullivan Global's assets for a mandatory investigation. I had just locked the doors of their own vault from the inside. That night, for the first time, I allowed myself a small luxury. I heated a can of beef stew on the old wood stove and sat by the fire, the warmth a strange alien sensation against my skin. I looked at the maps and the recordings, the evidence of my son's betrayal and my own resilience. I was 78 years old, and I was the most dangerous person in Julian Sullivan's life. I thought of the educational value of this moment, the hard, cold truth that autonomy is not something that is given. It is something that must be defended with the same ferocity with which it is attacked. I had spent my life believing that my value was in my service to others, in my role as a wife and a mother. But as the firelight flickered against the walls of the old house, I realized that my value was in my sovereign self. I was my own protector. I was my own justice. I began to prepare for the final confrontation. Silas was coordinating with a contact in the U.S. Attorney's Office, a woman named Detective Sarah Jenkins, who had been looking for a way to crack the Sullivan Global shell for months. We were no longer just two old people in a farmhouse. We were the center of a federal sting operation. I provided them with the recording of Miller, the digital trail of the forged signatures, and the geological surveys that proved the motive for the second wave of the fraud. We were building a case that didn't just target the bank loan, but the entire network of racketeering and witness tampering that Elena had constructed. I was the bait, and I was the hook. As I lay in bed that night, the wind howling through the rafters, I felt a profound sense of clarity. The path back to my life in Naperville was gone, and I realized I didn't want it back. That life had been built on a foundation of blind trust and a silence that had allowed a monster to grow in my own home. This cold, hard, authentic life in Galena, this was where I belonged. This was where the Iron Margaret had been born. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in months, I slept without dreaming of the FBI or the handcuffs. I dreamed of the deep earth, of the minerals that had waited 50 years for me to find them, and of the sun that would soon rise on the day of my reckoning. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. I walked to the edge of the property, looking out over the hills of Illinois, the land that my father and his father had worked. I felt a deep ancestral strength flowing through me. Julian and Eleanor had tried to use the old house as a dumping ground for a mother they no longer valued. They had turned it into a prison, but I had turned it into a fortress. I was ready to face them, not as a victim seeking mercy, but as a creditor seeking payment. The moral arc of my life was bending toward a justice that I was shaping with my own hands. I was Margaret Sullivan, and I was finally, truly, home. The transition from the frozen silence of the Galena farmhouse to the humid, aggressive heat of Chicago felt like moving between two different lifetimes. I sat in the back of a nondescript black sedan, my hands folded neatly in my lap, wearing the same modest navy suit I had worn to Thomas's funeral. I looked like a woman who had been hollowed out by grief, a grandmotherly figure who had lost her way in the world of high finance and federal indictments. But beneath the fabric of my sleeve, a sophisticated digital recorder was active, and in my mind, a cold, unwavering map of the coming battle was already drawn. Silas Vance sat beside me, his presence a silent pillar of granite. We weren't just going to a meeting. We were entering a theater of war, where the enemy didn't even realize the play had already begun. The drive through the suburbs of Naperville, past the familiar oak trees and the park where I used to take Julian to play, didn't trigger the tears I expected. Instead, it triggered a sharp, clinical observation of the rot that had been allowed to fester in the name of family loyalty. I saw my house, the house Thomas and I had built with 40 years of sweat and careful budgeting, and I saw the sleek, silver Mercedes parked in the driveway that didn't belong to any of us. It was a trophy of the theft, a gleaming symbol of the life Julian and Eleanor had bought with my dignity. We arrived at the downtown office of Miller, the private investigator who had tried to coerce me in the country. The air in the high-rise was thin and smelled of expensive floor wax and desperation. I walked with a calculated limp, leaning heavily on a cane that Silas had suggested I carry to emphasize my frailty. When we entered the conference room, Julian and Eleanor were already there, flanked by a team of lawyers who looked like they were carved from ice. Julian stood up, his face a masterpiece of manufactured concern. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking with a theatricality that made my stomach churn. "I'm so glad you decided to come in. We can fix all of this. We can get you to Florida and put this whole nightmare behind us." I didn't answer. I allowed Silas to pull out my chair, sitting down with a slow, labored movement that drew their pity. Eleanor didn't stand. She sat at the head of the table, her eyes scanning me like a predator checking for a pulse. "Margaret," she said, her voice a sharp, polished blade, We've finalized the transfer documents for the Galena property. Once you sign the secondary affidavits for the Sullivan Global Debt Restructuring, the federal authorities will have no choice but to look elsewhere for the discrepancy. You'll be safe. We'll all be safe. I looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't look away. I saw the arrogance in the way she held her pen, the way she dismissed me as a spent force. "You've been very busy, Eleanor," I said, my voice quiet, but carrying a weight that caused Julian's smile to falter. $2,500,000 is a lot of money to move in 90 days, sir. It must be exhausting, keeping track of all those shell companies in the Caymans while trying to decide which assisted living facility to dump your mother-in-law in. The room went silent. The lawyers shifted in their seats, their professional masks cracking. Julian's face went pale, the tan from his business trip suddenly looking like a cheap orange stain. "Mum, what are you talking about? You're confused. The stress of the farm." I reached into my bag and pulled out a stack of documents, sliding them across the polished mahogany table with a steady, deliberate hand. "I'm a librarian, Julian. I've spent my life organizing information. Did you really think I wouldn't notice that the IP addresses used to forge my digital signature on the bridge loans originated from your condo while I was at your father's graveside?" Silas leaned forward, his voice a low, rhythmic rumble that filled the space like a coming storm. "What my client is saying, Mr. Sullivan, is that the Sullivan Global Network is no longer a secret. We have the mineral rights surveys from Galena that prove you attempted to defraud the estate of a strategic asset. We have the recordings of your investigator attempting to intimidate a federal witness. And more importantly, we have the cooperation of the U.S. Attorney's Office." At that moment, the double doors of the conference room swung open, and Special Agent Miller, the real one, the one from the FBI, stepped in, followed by two other agents. The private meeting was over. The cleansing had begun. I watched as Elena's composure disintegrated, her eyes darting toward the door, her hands trembling as she tried to hide her phone. She wasn't a mastermind anymore. She was a cornered animal. Julian slumped into his chair, the charismatic mask sliding off to reveal a terrified, small boy who had finally run out of lies. The next 3 hours were a blur of legal maneuvers and the cold, surgical extraction of the truth. I sat in that room and watched as the network of power Julian and Eleanor had built, the corrupt bankers, the crooked lawyers, the false buyers, was dismantled piece by piece. I provided the final key, the hidden ledger from my father that contained the original, unencumbered deeds to the Naperville house, proving that the loan Julian had taken out was based on a fraudulent title. Because the property had never been legally transferred to him, the bank's lien was invalid against me, but fully enforceable as a criminal charge of bank fraud against him. I wasn't just clearing my name. I was reclaiming my home through the very laws they had tried to subvert. The educational value of this moment was a bitter, necessary medicine. I realized that the greatest protection a person has is not their money or their connections, but their autonomy and their refusal to be invisible. By refusing to play the victim, I had become the prosecutor. I looked at Julian as they led him toward the door in handcuffs. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of shock and a lingering, pathetic hope that I would still save him. "Mom, please," he whispered. "You can't do this to me. I'm your son." I stood up, my posture straight, the cane no longer necessary. "You ceased being my son the moment you used your father's memory to steal my life, Julian," I said, my voice devoid of the anger that had once consumed me. "Now you are simply a man facing the consequences of his choices. I'm not doing this to you. You did this to yourself. I am simply the one who kept the records." Eleanor was led out next, her face a mask of cold, silent fury. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at Julian. She was already calculating how to blame him for everything. But the digital trail I had helped the FBI uncover ensured that she would be walking the same path to a federal cell. The drive back to Naperville that evening was different. The rain had stopped, and the city lights reflected off the wet pavement like diamonds. I went back to my house, and walked through the rooms. The federal agents were gone, the tags had been removed, and the silence was no longer heavy with the threat of foreclosure. It was the silence of a clean slate. I walked into the kitchen and saw the bottle of wine Eleanor had been drinking, the one I had saved for a special occasion. I poured the rest of it down the sink, watching the red liquid vanish into the drain. I wasn't celebrating a victory. I was performing a rite of purification. I had survived the descent into the U-curve of despair, and I had emerged on the other side with a clarity that only fire can produce. I was 78 years old, and I was starting over, not as a widow or a mother, but as a sovereign individual who had stood her ground against the dark. I spent the next few days working with Silas to finalize the mineral rights sale. The funds would not only pay off any lingering legal fees, but would establish a foundation for elderly victims of financial abuse, a legacy for Thomas that would mean more than any house ever could. I realized that my pain had been a catalyst for a greater good, a way to turn a personal trauma into a public defense. The people of Naperville and Galena began to look at me differently, not with pity, but with a burgeoning respect. I was the woman who had fought the federal government and won, the librarian who had outsmarted the sharks. I had turned my old-fashioned values of integrity and meticulousness into a high-tech weapon of justice. As I sat on my porch in Naperville one last time before moving back to Galena to oversee the restoration of the farmhouse, I looked at the sunset. The sky was a bruised purple and gold, a beautiful, violent end to a long day. I felt a sense of peace that was deep and resonant. I had lost a son, but I had found a self. I had lost a home, only to realize that home was not a building, but the integrity of the soul. The scars would remain. The memory of Julian's betrayal would always be a shadow in the corner of my heart. But those scars were now my medals of honor. I was Margaret Sullivan, and I was no longer afraid of anything. I had faced the absolute zero of betrayal, and I had found the sun within. The transition from victimhood to agency is not a quiet path. It is a violent, necessary upheaval of everything you thought you knew about love and loyalty. For 40 years, I believed that my role was to absorb the blows for those I loved, to be the soft place for Julian to land. But in the cold light of the Galena farmhouse, I learned that true love requires the strength to say no, and true loyalty is to the truth, not to a person who hides from it. By holding Julian accountable, I was performing the ultimate act of motherhood. I was finally forcing him to grow up, even if it was behind a set of iron bars. I was reclaiming the power of my own narrative, writing an ending that wasn't about a mother's broken heart, but about a woman's unbreakable will. I looked at the framed photograph of Thomas one last time. I felt like he was smiling, not because I had won, but because I had stood up. I had defended the name he had given me, and I had defended the life we had built together. I closed the door to the Naperville house and turned the key, the sound a final, satisfying click. I was going back to the country, to the dirt and the minerals and the honest labor of restoration. I was going back to the old house, and this time I wasn't a prisoner. I was the owner. I was the architect. I was free. The trauma of betrayal is a profound earthquake that shatters the very architecture of a person's identity, leaving behind a landscape of jagged glass and cold ash. Yet in the aftermath of such devastation, There exists a sacred opportunity for a radical rebirth. To forgive oneself for the crime of being too trusting is the first step toward reclaiming a soul that was never truly lost, only momentarily overshadowed. I have learned that justice is not merely a verdict delivered by a man in a black robe, but a state of being where one's dignity is no longer negotiable. The light that found me in the ruins of my son's greed was not a miracle. It was the inevitable result of choosing the truth over the comfort of a lie. I carry the scars of this war not as wounds, but as proof that a heart, once broken, can be reforged into something far more resilient and infinitely more luminous than the original. The skyline of Chicago began to retreat in my rearview mirror, a jagged silhouette of glass and steel that no longer held the power to intimidate me. I was driving back to Galena, not as a fugitive or a victim seeking a place to hide, but as a woman returning to her foundations. The air in the car was cool, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the silence was not filled with the frantic echoes of betrayal. It was a solid, peaceful silence. The legal storm had reached its peak and broke, leaving behind a clarity that only a tempest can provide. Julian and Eleanor were now names on a federal docket, their lives a tangled mess of court dates and public defenders, while I was just Margaret Sullivan again. But I was a different Margaret. The woman who had spent decades accommodating the weaknesses of others had been replaced by a woman who understood the high price of integrity. As I crossed the county line, the rolling hills of Joe Daviess County greeted me like old friends, their deep greens and burnt oranges shimmering under the late afternoon sun. I realized that while Julian had tried to exile me to this worthless old house, he had inadvertently handed me the keys to my own kingdom. The restoration of the farmhouse became my daily meditation. I didn't hire a massive crew to swoop in and erase the history of the place with granite countertops and sterile lighting. Instead, I worked with Silas Vance to find local craftsmen who understood the language of old wood and limestone. Every morning, I would wake up to the sound of hammers and the scent of fresh pine, a sensory reminder that something broken could be made whole again if given enough time and care. I spent my days in the garden, pulling weeds that had choked the soil for a decade, feeling the dark, rich Illinois earth under my fingernails. It was a grounding labor, a physical manifestation of the mental weeding I was doing within myself. I was digging up the roots of guilt, the stubborn vines of what if, and the thorns of a mother's misplaced shame. I began to understand that I couldn't be responsible for the character of a grown man, even if I had been the one to teach him his first words. Julian had chosen his path, and by allowing the law to take its course, I had finally stopped being an accomplice to his destruction. The news of the mineral rights sale hit the local papers a month later, but the architect of the fraud headlines had been replaced by something far more meaningful. The Sullivan Dignity Fund was officially established, a foundation dedicated to providing legal and financial protection for the elderly against predatory family members. I sat in Silas's office as we signed the final papers, the sunlight pouring over the mahogany desk. "You've done more than just save yourself, Margaret," Silas said, his eyes reflecting a deep professional respect. "You've built a lighthouse for people who are currently drowning in the same sea you were in." I looked at the pen in my hand, the same hand that had once trembled when Julian asked for a signature, and I felt a profound sense of closure. The $2,500,000 that had been the source of so much pain was now being converted into a shield for others. My father's secret ledger had become a testament to the fact that the earth beneath our feet holds more than just minerals. It holds the legacy of our ancestors' resilience. Winter arrived in Galena with a fierce, quiet beauty. The farmhouse, now sturdy and warm, stood against the howling winds like a sentinel. I spent the long evenings by the fireplace, reading the books I had saved from the Naperville house, the ones that held the memories of Thomas. I found a letter he had tucked into an old edition of Whitman's poetry, a short note written years ago when Julian was still a teenager. Maggie, it read in his steady, slanted script, never forget that you are the anchor. The waves will come and the wind will blow, but as long as you know where the shore is, we will never be lost. I held the paper against my chest, the tears finally coming. Not the hot, stinging tears of betrayal, but the soft, healing rain of a grief that had finally found its peace. Thomas had seen the strength in me long before I was forced to find it myself. I wasn't an anchor because I held things down. I was an anchor because I stayed true to the bottom when everything else was drifting. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the federal correctional facility where Julian was awaiting final sentencing. I stared at the envelope for a long time, the handwriting familiar and yet so distant. I didn't open it immediately. I made myself a cup of tea, sat by the window, and watched the snow blanket the fields. When I finally broke the seal, the words inside were a desperate plea for a character reference, a request for me to tell the judge about the boy he used to be. He spoke of Eleanor as the one who led him astray, the one who whispered the ideas into his ear. He was still hiding, still shifting the weight of his own soul onto someone else's shoulders. I picked up my own pen and wrote a single sentence in response. The boy you used to be is a memory I will always cherish, but the man you chose to become is someone I no longer know. I didn't send a reference. I didn't offer a lifeline. To do so would have been an insult to the journey I had just completed. I was no longer a soft place to land. I was the hard truth he needed to face. The community in Galena began to change around me as well. I was no longer the strange woman in the old house. I became a fixture at the local library, volunteering to organize their historical archives. I saw the way people looked at me now, not with suspicion, but with a quiet, appreciative curiosity. I was a woman who had faced the ultimate betrayal and didn't break. I began to host small gatherings at the farmhouse, inviting other women who had lost their husbands or felt invisible in their own lives. We talked about autonomy, about the law, and about the importance of keeping one's own keys. I realized that the education I had gained through my trauma was a gift I could share. I was teaching them that aging is not a process of disappearing, but a process of refining. We were like the minerals in the ground, compressed by time and pressure until we became something indestructible. As the first signs of spring began to peek through the melting snow, I took a walk to the edge of the property where the mineral plot sat. The state had begun its preliminary work, but they were doing it with a respect for the land that I had insisted upon in the contract. I stood on the ridge, looking out over the river, and I felt a lightness that was almost holy. My life in Naperville was a closed book, a beautiful story with a tragic middle and a triumphant ending. I didn't miss the suburban comforts or the social circles that had vanished the moment the handcuffs clicked. I preferred the cold, honest wind of the country and the company of people who knew the value of a hard-earned reputation. I had lost my home, my money, and my son, but in the ruins I had found Margaret. And Margaret was more than enough. The final legal hurdles were cleared by the time the lilacs began to bloom. The Naperville house was sold, the debts were settled, and the Sullivan Dignity Fund was thriving. I sat on my new porch, the wood smooth and warm under my feet, and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of violet and gold. The scars were still there, of course. A permanent ache in my heart whenever I saw a mother and son laughing in the park. A sudden chill whenever I heard a voice that sounded like Elena's. But those scars didn't define me anymore. They were the topography of my survival, the map of a journey that had led me back to my own strength. I was 79 years old, and for the first time in my life, I was completely, unapologetically free. I had survived the U-curve of the soul, and the view from the other side was breathtaking. I looked at the old farmhouse, its white paint gleaming in the twilight, and I knew that it would stand for another 100 years. It had survived neglect, storms, and the attempt to turn it into a prison. It was a home again, and so was I. I walked inside, the floorboards offering a familiar, welcoming creak, and closed the door. I didn't lock it out of fear anymore. I locked it simply because I was the one who held the key, and I was the only one who decided who was allowed to enter my sanctuary. The story of the Sullivan fraud was over. The story of Margaret's rebirth was just beginning. I turned off the lamp and let the moonlight fill the room, a cool silver light that revealed everything exactly as it was meant to be. The journey through trauma is not a straight line, but a spiral that leads us deeper into ourselves than we ever thought possible. To face the betrayal of one's own blood is to stare into an abyss that threatens to swallow every good memory and every shred of hope. Yet it is precisely in that darkness that we find the iron within, the part of us that cannot be stolen, forged, or broken. I have learned that the ultimate form of self-care is not comfort, but the fierce protection of one's own dignity and legal autonomy. Forgiveness is not a gift we give to those who hurt us. It is the act of unburdening our own hearts so that we can walk toward the light. I carry my history not as a weight, but as a foundation. The woman I was before the storm was a person of quiet service. The woman I am now is a person of sovereign strength. We are never too old to rise, never too broken to be remade, and never too lost to find our way home to ourselves.